Hello and welcome to another segment of Delaware State University Inside Perspective. I'm Carlos Holmes, and this is the show where we talk with faculty, staff, students, alumni, and guests about some of the things that are going on in the world and some of the great things that are going on at Delaware State University. Here at Delaware State University today, we're blessed to have Dr. Chana Lee. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for joining me today. Dr. Lee is the author of this book, For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fanie Lou Hamer. And she's come here to share her experiences in writing the book and the story of Mrs. Hamer. And we're just so glad to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
This is a tremendous book, and I'm not saying because you're just sitting here. I've been reading it, and it's riveting. It is a riveting book. Now, tell me, what generated your interest in Fanie Lou Hamer to the extent that you went on to do your dissertation and then write this book?
Well, I remember when I was about 12 years old, I saw this PBS documentary called Never Turn Back. And I was really taken by the fact that there was this very plain-spoken woman who clearly was poor, marginalized, very passionate. And I told myself when I grew up I was going to learn more about her. Soon after watching that PBS special, my mom took me to the library and I found my first book on her, which was like a child's primer by June Jordan. And since that moment, I decided, okay, I'm going to definitely follow her, and I did. And my interest has taken shape over the years. Initially, it was just I needed to find any and everything about her. What did it mean to live in Mississippi? Why was she a part of the movement and I didn't know about the movement? I had always had an interest in the movement from the time that I was 5, because I remember King's assassination. So at each step along the way, as I went through school, I decided to pick up more and more information about her, and eventually it became a dissertation.
Her background, she began kind of raised in a sharecropping family. She became a sharecropper herself, her husband, before she entered the civil rights movement.
Yeah, she was born the last of 20 children to 2 Mississippi sharecroppers, Luella Bramlett and also her father, James Lee Townsend. I got a chance to meet her sister, who told me a little bit about her childhood. Growing up very poor, obviously, shaped Fanie Lou Hamer's political perspective. Her mother was one of 23 children born to her mother, and she was the only one who had a black father. And very early on, Fanie Lou Hamer came to learn about sort of black women's vulnerability in that way. So she knew that they were desperately poor. She knew that she was a black girl becoming a black woman. And she knew that quite possibly she would be stuck in this station for the rest of her life.
Now, but as a sharecropper, especially in her young adult years, she became known as what is known as a timekeeper, which was kind of a sort of elevated position. It was a position of influence. Is this something that gave her some natural ability once it became time to, leadership ability, once it became time to enter the civil rights movement?
That's right. One of the things that she took pride in being a timekeeper, because it meant that you had to have a certain level of skill in terms of math. But it also meant that you had to deal with the big man, and you had to deal with the quote-unquote little people in terms of being able to advocate for them. When they came to the timekeeper, they came to weigh their cotton. And in the case of Fanie Lou Hamer, she clearly was sympathetic to them, but she also was accountable to the landowner. And so she found herself being a sort of mediator of sorts at times, but also at times she found herself in a position where she could help those who were clearly being cheated year after year as a sharecropper. I tell the story in the book about how she used to keep a weighted or loaded pea on her person, and any time that she encountered a family who had come to weigh and the landowner was present and it was clear that they were being cheated, she would slip this pea on the scale, thereby making it seem like the family had picked more cotton than he was giving them credit for.
Once Fanie Lou Hamer was in the civil rights movement, she was in it.
That's right.
Beginning with the ultimately successful attempt to get herself registered to vote, and then involved in other voter registration type activities, civil rights activities. But along the way, she endured violence, a brutal jail beating, which just was brutal to read about. Harassment, daily threats of violence, but she never quit. Is this the most enduring part of her legacy?
I think that her courage, certainly not quitting, required that you convince yourself that you can go on, but not only go on, that you feel like it's necessary to go on for not just yourself but for others. And so there was this sense of obligation to others, I think, that certainly stands out as a part of her legacy. She was very used to sacrificing for herself. I tell the story of the 1963 Winona beating, and clearly she could have quit after that particular occasion.
I would have thought about it, man, the way they beat her in that.
That's right. And to think that she was simply trying to learn how to train people to register to vote, and she'd come back from this trip, stopped by the police. This had been the second big time that she had been stopped and harassed by the police, trying to do the same thing, and taking her into the jail cell, separated them 2 by 2, took a black long piece of a billy club that was a weighted kind of instrument, and began to beat her, and she thought she was going to die. And when she survived that, she felt that she had a kind of calling. And so it was one thing to suffer, to sacrifice, but to make it through those moments was very instructive to her and inspired her to make sure that she kept doing the same thing. And so I would say that was a part of her legacy.
Now, she began in civil rights really in the grassroots level in Mississippi, in the Delta. And if you know Mississippi and you know the Delta, these were not rich people down there. These were struggling people, struggling black folks. It could be argued there were struggling white folks down there, but there were certainly landowners down there that benefited. But she worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, so that kind of injected her into their national movement. And then she was involved very instrumental in the establishment of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And this was revolutionary. For one thing, it threw her on the stage at the 1964 Democratic Convention and kind of gave her some national exposure. But also, this was kind of revolution. Explain to our viewers why this was so revolutionary, the creation of this party.
Well, in 1964, the numbers for black registration were extremely low. In fact, there were only 6.7% of African Americans who were eligible to vote were registered to vote. And by that moment, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had decided that it was going to make a priority voter registration. And when they first met Hamer, she was definitely willing to do that and make that her cause. And so by 1964, they had decided that they were going to form this alternative grassroots party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. They found it historically necessary. Since 1890, Mississippi had had the poll tax. It had had literacy clauses. It had used all of these sort of devices and these legal and extra-legal measures to keep black people from mainstream politics for the better of 70 years.
Wouldn't allow them to vote.
Wouldn't allow them to vote. And not only that, that could cost you your life. And Hamer knew this. And so they decided that they were not going to continue to try to be a part of the mainstream Democratic Party, the state, all-white, lily-white state party, Democratic Party. And that what they would do would form their alternative party, and that they would go to the national convention where they nominate, the president and the vice president for their party and challenge the seating of that state party. And they did so by claiming that we represent the true people of Mississippi. We're the true party of Mississippi. We include everyone. We agree with the Democratic Party's platform. And so therefore, rightly, we should be seated. So it was a very radical gesture for 68 people, largely a group of farmers, to be able to go and make this challenge.
I'm going to make a command call because I'm enjoying this conversation. And I'm going to conclude this part 1.
Okay.
And we're going to roll with a part 2 on this because this is absolutely fascinating. Because I'm sure some of you might be like me. I've heard the name Fanie Lou Hamer for years, but I really didn't know her story. So we're going to hear more about it in part 2. In the meanwhile, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Lee, and thank you for joining us for another segment of DSU Inside Perspective. Y'all have a good day now.